Do you know what I've realized? Like, every single episode we have a missed opportunity for.
What's that?
We could have had an opening crawl every single time.
We could have had an opening crawl every single time. That would have let everyone know what we had going on the podcast, all the episodes before they tuned in.
Yeah, get people caught up and, like, let people know where we're going rather than, like, making them check the comments. But, yeah. So today we're talking about opening crawls and Star Wars. And what kind of inspired the opening crawls of Star Wars?
Yeah, so the Star Wars, obviously, A New Hope, just Star Wars when it came out, had the opening crawl, and it was inspired a lot in part by the old serials, right? Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, as they made the jump from, I guess, comic book and, comic print runs and newspapers and things like that to these little snippets of stories you would get on the big screen. It would start with kind of this opening sort of, paragraph or two that basically caught you up on where you're going, because you might not have seen all of these serial shorts, or you might have missed some or skipped one, or, whatever the case was. So this gave you kind of the background on what you needed to know going into the story. And, George Lucas took a lot of inspiration from those stories. So it made sense when he was creating Star Wars, which was kind of an homage to that kind of swashbuckling storytelling, that he would do the same. And, Star Wars is a big universe, so there's a lot of information that you need to know going into this thing, because already you're like, this is pretty crazy with a crazy cast of characters. So it gives you a little bit of background.
Yeah, and kind of part of why people needed opening crawls back in the day is, like, they didn't have DVDs, they didn't have, like TV on demand, where they could just, like, Google it, and figure out what was going on. So, like, it did serve a purpose to have an opening crawl kind of establishing, like, points A, B, C, and, characters X, Y, Z,
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of makes sense that it's there.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and those came out in the late 30s. There was also a film called Union Pacific, which came out in 1939, which had a crawl that was moving. I think that the crawl in Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon were more kind of just static, kind of details about what was coming up. But the Union Pacific one actually was, kind of traveling up this train tracks, the Union Pacific, train line, as it were. And that really kind of inspired when, the creative team came on to, start doing the lights and magic bit of Star Wars and putting that together. They took a lot of inspiration, I guess, from the way that looked in Union Pacific, how kind of the dialogue was traveling, kind of up the screen and kind of blurring out as it got further and further out of focus.
Yeah, I'll have to watch Union Pacific, but that's for sure a major inspiration. And all Star Wars Skywalker Saga movies begin with a crawl, and most Solo is inspired by a crawl, I would say, and Rogue One didn't have one, but they thought about long and hard, like, are we going to have one, and then decided on no. But even the games have them. Clone Wars has crawl adjacent, like, little fortunes, So Star Wars has usually something before the main story.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So when Rogue One and Solo came out and they didn't have crawls, people were like, what? You can't have Star Wars without a crawl. But, George Lucas had done the Clone Wars film, which didn't have a crawl either. So it kind of, was something that was easy enough to separate, kind of into the Skywalker saga itself and kind of keep it there. And I like that because it gives those films kind of the same flavor and the same setup and, kind of the same, sort of feelings deep in your soul when they're getting ready to start, and you get the fanfare and it kicks off a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And then you get the crawl that's, kind of iconic and something that can kind of tie that Skywalker Saga story together. So I kind of like that they play around with some different things, kind of that fly through in Solo when it's going through the main title logo there, and then the fortune cookies that we had in Clone Wars. I think that it's good to explore and push the bounds because, yeah, like I said, the title crawl is kind of rooted into the Skywalker Saga. And part of that, I think, is because, like I mentioned, Star Wars, obviously, like I mentioned, everyone knows Star Wars is this big, huge, universe of characters and things. And, when A New Hope came out in 1977, no one knew that there were going to be any more of these stories. So it was really the opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork for, what all this universe had to offer.
Yeah, and guess what had an opening crawl too, because it was inspired by Star Wars.
What is that?
Knights of the Old Republic, the 2003 video game that we don't talk enough about.
That's right. Yeah, 4,000 years before the rise of the Galactic Empire, the Republic verges on collapse. Darth Malak, last surviving apprentice of the Dark Lord Revan, has unleashed an invincible Sith armada upon an unsuspecting galaxy.
Crushing all resistance, Malak's war of conquest has left the Jedi Order scattered and vulnerable as countless knights fall in battle, and many more swear allegiance to the new Sith Master. In the skies above the outer rim world of Terrace, a Jedi battle fleet engages the forces of Darth Malak in a desperate effort to halt the Sith's galactic domination.
Yeah, it really kind of sets the background for the story and where you're jumping into. It's actually something we talked about with the Hero's Journey podcast. Kind of that first step of the hero's journey is everyday life, and you don't get that in video games really, because no one wants to play where you're sweeping up the floor. You want to just get straight into the action. So to me, I think that the opening crawl in something like KOTOR kind of serves as that first step, to kind of give you the ordinary life that you have going into when you wake up.
Yeah. And then it kind of just starts, and it starts epically, and the music kind of shows that musically.
Yeah, exactly. But we talked a little bit about kind of where the Star Wars crawl came from. And I mentioned that it kind of feels to me rooted in like the Skywalker Saga, but really kind of feels rooted in that specific time of movie making. Like it didn't spawn a lot of other opening crawls. You didn't see those in a lot of films. There was an opening crawl like in Airplane 2 and Revenge of the Nerds 2 and Spaceballs, but those were done more as like an homage or a parody of Star Wars doing it, as opposed to, oh man, this opening crawl is a really great way to get into the story. So it was never something that really went beyond like the bounds of Star Wars, I guess, coming off of those old serials from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah. In our podcast, I mean, we kind of went over, like, what an adaptation, like, how we would have an opening crawl look like. What would yours look like? Just, like, a little pitch of what yours would look like.
So I have kind of a couple ideas in my head that I think would be pretty good. If you wanted to do something that was akin to an opening crawl, to keep it kind of in the Star Wars universe, I would like to see it more as something as like scripted into like ancient texts and glyphs and kind of stuff like that as we're telling the story. If I was going to do something, like I said, more akin to like an opening crawl where you're actually putting like letters on the screen that you're having to read to get the background of this story. But I think if I was really shooting and filming a KOTOR film, I would do something more along the lines of, what we see in more modern films where you're actually kind of doing like a narration over it. And I think something like what you've got started up with the Bastila audio drama really would set a good kind of opening first couple of minutes to get the background of everything leading up to Terrace, that you could tell that story pretty quickly and pretty snappily and get you into it. But what about you? What kind of ideas or thoughts do you have about doing like an opening crawl or a crawl adjacent kind of thing?
I was very inspired by the Vikings, the Kirk Douglas film, when I saw it. And it's kind of like a melding of like the visuals, kind of like tapestries of the day, and kind of explaining like what's going on, the story, and like you get the credits and everything. So maybe something like that, but I kind of think, like, make it look like a different age, and I'm very inspired by, like, oral storytelling, kind of like Beowulf and, like, the Odyssey, Homer and the Iliad. So, like, why not, like, kind of have a narrator, but, like, not like the usual kind of narration. It's kind of like you're telling a story, like you're kind of telling the poem of the galaxy, I think. Like the grand poem, and I think it could reflect it in kind of a different way of doing it, and it would be cool to see people be inventive and kind of reinvent what Star Wars is.
Yeah, for sure. I think it would be neat to see, something else. We mentioned obviously Rogue One, Solo. Clone Wars didn't have specifically a crawl, and I think it's okay to get away from it. So that kind of, I guess, brings me to kind of I don't know, in my head at least, there are like two kind of current ways that movies tell, kind of this backstory bit without, really like diving into it. And one I think actually would be a really neat kind of interpretation, something you could do in Star Wars in a KOTOR story, especially. And kind of the thing that comes to mind is you have like the films of the Harry Potter, and then when they get to the final concluding chapter of that, the Deathly Hallows, and they need to tell you the background, the history of what the Deathly Hallows are, and it changes to kind of this hand-drawn, very ancient-looking kind of cartooning style, and it's telling you the history of the Deathly Hallows. I think that you could do something like that in the KOTOR world, maybe. I don't know, maybe it's as Karth is telling you after you get down to the surface of Terrace. Maybe it's a conversation you're having with Bastila and Dantooine. Maybe it's, taking place at kind of that first star map piece. But you could do something like that and do something animated, and I think that would be really, really, really cool and interesting. I think maybe they did that in the last SWTOR trailer, something animated like that, I think. So I think that something like that would fit in really nicely into a KOTOR story.
Even in a video game, you could, like, kind of tell these little miniature stories in, like, a different kind of mini game as well. So there's always ways to kind of reinterpret things, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of how they handle that in the Jedi Fallen Order, if anyone's played that. I'm not going to get into huge spoilers, but part of as you're going through those games and you're unlocking your new ability every time you are unlocking one, you're doing it via kind of like this flashback sort of little section kind of thing. So that's, kind of an interesting way that they can bring that into the video game realm there.
Yeah. And what are some other films you kind of like the exposition in, or like you kind of notice like this is poorly done exposition?
So the other way I mentioned kind of like this break and doing like an animated or like a campfire story type of thing where you're kind of like breaking the action in the middle of your movie. The other kind of way that like in my head at least that I've noticed it and have seen it done, and the best example of this that comes to mind is the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. I'm not saying Peter Jackson did it the first, but he did an excellent job and really had to sell it because he knew that Tolkien's world was so huge and so vast, and the history of these rings were so huge and vast, and he only had like 9 hours to tell this story. So, he says, I'm going to take the first 10 minutes of Fellowship of the Ring and I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about it. And that's going to set you up to watch the next, 8 hours and 50 minutes of this film and not have any questions about what's going on with these rings. This is exactly what it is. And I think that was handled really, really well. It's kind of interesting because you're actually getting to see it, as opposed to a crawl. So you're seeing kind of the history. It's being narrated by Galadriel. So it's almost like, kind of like a reading disposition from like a history text, which I think is great. And then more currently to that, they did something very similar, Denis Villeneuve in Dune,
love it.
where Chani is doing kind of the same kind of thing, right? Reading it almost as like a religious text about, who these planets, who these people are. And like I said, really getting you set up to understand what you're about to watch.
Yeah, and sometimes I used to hesitate, and I really didn't like it when it felt like they were showing versus telling, but I'm like, how else are you supposed to get people on board with a Dune movie or Lord of the Rings movie? You have to start from somewhere. So I used to be like, shout, don't tell. But I'm like, could I do that any better? And the answer is like, of course not, you know? So I came around to Lord of the Rings, you know, and Dune is perfect. Episode 101, we talk about what Star Wars can learn from Dune, you know? So it is kind of a battle, you know, because a movie is a visual medium. How do we show versus tell? When's the right time to tell? It's a battle, you know?
Right. Yeah, and I think, for me at least, the takeaway that I get from it is that you can't have those show don't tell moments in things like Dune, in things like Lord of the Rings, in things, maybe even to an extent like Harry Potter or Star Wars, if you don't have that foundational groundwork laid, because then it's totally lost in translation. You're not able to pick up on like the nuance of a show don't tell kind of a thing. You have to have kind of, you know, one kind of piggybacks off the other. You can't do one without laying a little bit of groundwork, I think.
Yeah. And I don't know, it'll be interesting to see what the future of Star Wars evolves into, but it's always been inspired by a crawl, and we'll see what other stories that are told and what they do and how they tell them. It's just interesting because we just live in interesting times.
Yeah, for sure. And I did want to, you know, kind of mention too, you know, those were kind of some film, you know, kind of ones that came to my mind. And I think the directors are getting a little bit more creative in the way that they do it. You know, especially like, you know, Lord of the Rings, I'd mentioned, you know, like 9 hours of storytelling. And you have kind of the same, well, not the same. No one has the same amount of depth as Tolkien did for his world, but you know, in something like Game of Thrones, you know, they're not telling the story of Game of Thrones in 9 hours. They're telling it in like 80 hours. So you don't have the agency to really get that background kind of laid. You can, you know, dribble it out over, you know, the course of 5, 6, 7 seasons. So I think that directors are getting, you know, and, you know, camera operators and musicians and lighting departments are able to kind of, you know, play with those over this long form storytelling, which is, you know, sort of kind of risen itself up, I guess, in the, you know, time of streaming services that we're in now.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about Game of Thrones and the House of the Dragon in the future. It's an episode we're both very excited for, but yeah, like long form storytelling, it's television, and like if you understand anything about me, it's like I'm like, if a movie is longer than 90 minutes, it failed, you know. So I guess I'm just gonna have to get a new bladder or something, and just like be okay with like, cool, this movie is 3 hours and 40 minutes, you know. And all the other nominated ones are kind of that long too, you know? Yeah, for sure. They're going to need to start implementing the intermission, I think, into the movies as we're pushing 3 hours. The new Black Panther is coming out this coming week. I think it's close to 3 hours. You know, Batman was at 3 hours earlier this year. So, yeah, it's good. It's a tough time. Yeah, if you need a break. So, but yeah, I don't know. I don't really know where to go from that. But I think it's fun to talk about the crawl and to think about, you know, where it came from and why it existed in the first place. So, two questions.
Yeah, fun stuff. Yeah, of course.
What if Star Wars had intermissions? What would they look like?
If Star Wars had an intermission, I would like it to like break the fourth wall, and like Poe Dameron just looks at the audience as like, take your break.
That would be funny. I guess, like, I would see it kind of as a meditation. Like, stuff is happening on screen, but it's not like you're missing anything. And, like, maybe, like, the Jedi or Sith is, like, calibrating their lightsaber as they meditate, you know? So it's kind of like, what was that one, like, was it, like, Zones on Disney Plus, like, where it was kind of about the sound of everything?
Oh, yeah, shoot, what was that called? Biomes. You had biomes, you had the, I forget what the name of it was, but you had like the ship fly-throughs too, but Yeah, there you go. Something like that.
Something like that could work for an intermission for Star Wars, and like maybe like the intermission could be more of a narrative device or something, or at least just like part of the world of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and pretty much in every kind of Star Wars iteration, you get some sort of big force moment, kind of somewhere about halfway through the story. So yeah, that seems like that would be a good fitting time to kind of break, as you go into the final act, if you were going to do something crazy like have an intermission, I think.
Yeah. So we're just full of ideas that probably, lead nowhere, but we like having them, and we hope you guys enjoyed listening to them. Anything else we should impart before we depart?
No, not really. I think that's going to wrap it up for Star Wars Crawls. Now, when I was doing a little bit of research for this, I came across a lot of articles that ranked the Star Wars Crawls, which I never even thought was something that could happen. So let us know in the comments or in social media what your favorite Star Wars Crawl is, I guess.
It's episode 3.
It's episode 3, so that is a pretty good one. That's fair. That's fair. So yeah, but let us know if it's not episode 3, and let us know why. And yeah, I think that that's fun. Let us know also if you have any good ideas for how to handle opening crawls going forward. Like I said, so I don't know. I think that's it. It's time for the closing crawl.
They're called the end credits.
End credits, indeed. So thanks for joining us, everyone. May the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.